Okay, Alan, let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar.
Okay. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on CoSA Emerging Leaders, our award recipients for the past year. So today's agenda, we're going to hear from our CoSA-Ancestry Leadership Award recipients, our Victoria Iron Walch Emerging Leaders and Archive recipients, and our Archival Leadership Institute attendees. And then we're going to have time for question and answers and give you a little bit of what's upcoming at CoSA programs and webinars. Our presenters today, and I'm going to introduce them before each of their presentations, but here's our presenters for today. So for the CoSA-Ancestry 2019 Leadership Award winners were Katherine Giles and James Watson. Our Victoria Irons Walch 2019 Emerging Leader in Archives winner was Tyler Stumpf, and Archives Leadership Institute 2019 attendees Kathy Popovich and Elena Lozano. So our first presenter today is Katherine Giles. Katherine joined the State Records Branch at the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives in 2016 and became manager of the branch in 2019. The branch oversees the development of records retention schedules and archives and records management programs for Kentucky state government agencies. Let's welcome Katherine, and I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. First, before I get started, I want to go ahead and, again, thank CoSA and Ancestry for this award and the leadership development opportunity. I also want to thank Beth Shields, who was the Kentucky State Archivist. She nominated me for this, and I can't appreciate it enough. Thanks to this award, I was able to take managerial and leadership courses from the Celerity Group, which is a company based out of Lexington, Kentucky that offers these types of training. I took 4 modules, but today I will be reviewing 2 of them, and they are pretty focused on, managing people and that sort of thing. So in fact, my first slide. So managing people, this training course covered how managers should work with direct reports, peers, superiors, and customers to achieve goals. One of the things this training emphasized was that managers get things done through other people, and that's the best way to get them done effectively. This is called the managerial mindset. So while I definitely consider my branch a team and a really good one, ultimately, as their manager, I have to make sure that we're getting our work done and meeting our agency's missions and goals and that sort of thing. So that's a transition I've had to navigate, having started in the branch as a records analyst and then becoming a manager. It's a change in motivations and goals and that sort of thing. The first thing that I took away from this class is that delegation is key. That may seem like obvious information to everyone, but I am definitely a person who says yes to a lot of projects or tasks, and I try to do the work on my own. This may be due to trauma from group projects during my school years, but it's not helpful to my role. It's not helpful to the branch. For one, it sets a precedent that I will do all the things, which could potentially lead to reverse delegation, which is when staff asks for a manager's assistance even when they're fully capable of doing the task, or in the case of some customer bases, like for us state agency employees, when they start expecting you to do their work for them, like filling out their forms because they don't know how, but you can do it because you do know how. It also makes it seem like I don't have confidence in my staff to do a task correctly, which is absolutely not the case, and that could potentially risk, decreasing motivation, which is, of course, something to avoid. So as a result of this course, I'm certainly more aware of my tendency to try to be the problem solver or the task doer. more and more when I'm presented with a situation or a problem, I try to avoid saying, I'll just take care of it or let me handle it. Instead, I try to offer advice if that's needed, or I try to be just a sounding board, because sometimes people come to you with a problem or a concern or something and they just want to talk it out. And if you try to jump in with your own solution, it really kind of stunts them or prevents them from coming up with one themselves, and prevents them from growing in their role. So for the most part, I also think that people are just people like being capable of solving their problems or knowing how to find their answer. So I also try to direct people as I'm helping them, like, here's the website with these resources. I'll walk you through them, but, you know, it helps them to know where to go next time. And when it comes to motivation, I just feel really lucky that the people in my branch are so good and they're such hard workers without any help from me. But it's also important for me to recognize that they've had to go through a transition too. So it's not just about me being a manager and growing in my role. It's also about them working with me as a manager and kind of seeing me differently in a different way than how we've previously worked. I can't expect them to have the same relationships with me that we had when we were peers or that they had with the previous manager before me. Motivation relies a lot on these relationships that we build and maintain with each other. So in developing or redeveloping these relationships, I'm trying to show that as a manager, I'm in a better position to show support and provide more opportunities when possible for training or, provide more responsibilities in a positive way, something if they're, looking to develop their career in a certain way that can help them along. Because in this position, I'm more capable of doing that. So something I'm also trying to work on is to consistently provide feedback outside of the annual evaluation. Evaluations shouldn't be a surprise, and I think sometimes they are, and that can certainly demotivate people when they think they've been doing a great job or what have you, and suddenly once a year you say, well, here's something we could have talked about, but I'm just bringing to you now. So it's easy to neglect regular feedback when things are going well or you have other tasks you've prioritized, so that's certainly something I'm trying to be better about. So how to coach, this training course focused on coaching, the idea of coaching, managing through coaching, which is providing encouragement, feedback, and support, helping performers improve or be better, get better than they already are. One thing that was mentioned here was active listening, which is something I'm also trying to improve on. So, the goal of active listening is to improve mutual understanding. I think multitasking is great, and I think it's really encouraged, and sometimes it has to be done. You just have a lot of stuff to get done with close deadlines or something. But, when it comes to being a better listener, you have to not multitask. Focusing is key, and eliminating distractions is important to being a better listener. I think that can also help with building those relationships and increasing motivation, making sure that you're focused on the person who's speaking to you, especially if you're trying to help them through something or if they're trying to inform you of something. I think that's really important. And very briefly, I want to touch on SMART goal setting. I'm sure that most people have heard of SMART goal setting. It's an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals. I mentioned this because it's a really good tool for coaching and for myself personally, setting my own goals, making sure I'm meeting the tasks that I need to be meeting, but also making sure that, when you're speaking with your direct reports or whoever in a group project or group setting or something, that everyone is aware of their expectations. I think SMART goal setting is really helpful with that. So really quickly, I would like to discuss this session. There were so many great sessions and discussions that took place at the annual meeting, but this one in particular, I've continued to think about. This session, transparency in record scheduling and appraisal. The topic was public input and interest in public record scheduling, which is very important to my branch, the state records branch, where that is certainly something we do. The way NARA has made changes to the process of how the public can review schedules and how public perception of records transparency can affect how public officials engage in records retention is super relevant to me, especially now as we are working with various agency heads to try to get records transferred to the state archives as the end of term approaches. So it's really interesting. I don't know how it is at other states, but in Kentucky we have a commission and we have a subcommittee, and those two groups meet to review revisions to records retention schedules. And the public is welcome to attend those meetings, but since I've been here, I don't know that I've seen a really high level of public engagement in that way. And it was interesting to see how NARA is working to encourage the public and engage the public in a way where they feel commenting on scheduling and appraisal is much easier for them. So I don't know that there is one best approach when it comes to public input on record scheduling, but I'm certainly always interested in hearing how other agencies do it, how you engage the public and other stakeholders like your state agency employees in making sure that everyone who has an interest in public records are sharing their concerns and their thoughts. So again, I want to thank CoSA and Ancestry for this opportunity. It was really good to connect with people in the same field at the annual meeting and to talk about shared concerns and thoughts, and not just rant to my friends and family who probably have little interest in what I do. So thank you so much. And Alan, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Katherine. Next, we're going to hear from James Watson. James has been employed as an appraisal archivist with the Maryland State Archives for the last 14 years. He coordinates with various state, county, and municipal agencies in the development of records retention schedules, disposals, and the transfer of permanent records to the state archives. In addition, he oversees project management of digitization projects within the archives and for outside agencies. I'm going to turn it over to James now to present.
Thank you, Alan. Hope everyone can hear me well. Today what I'm going to be going over is a brief review of the presentation that I gave at the Austin conference. Again, before I go into it, as Katherine, I wanted to say thank you to CoSA and Ancestry for the award that allowed me to take this course and just being able to present this information that I was able to learn. So the course I attended was through AIM, which is a separate organization that's for the Information and Image Management. And so their course specifically was for Electronic Records Management Specialist course. This course basically looked at all levels of electronic records from the point of creation to management and then potentially in some instances the disposition of records themselves. So the course itself was broken down into multiple modules. What I have on the screen here is just a selection of some of the modules, but for this presentation, I'm only really going to focus on two specific sets of modules, which is the creation and management of metadata, and then the how to handle for electronic records that are potentially at risk. So for the metadata section itself, what this course focused on was breaking down metadata into certain categories, and the categories I've listed on the screen in this slide cover basically a metadata describing the record itself, things that you commonly would see about when describing even a physical record, the title of it, when it was created, things of that nature. You also want to look at things where they classified as search and discovery, and discovery can be twofold here. A lot of times discovery, a lot of times in records management, we'll think of things in terms of legal discovery, and in this instance, they're not necessarily talking in per se legal discovery. It's more about how a person in the public would be able to discover or identify that record in a collection, but it can sometimes go hand in hand with legal discovery as well. The next category was described as what we call agent metadata, which is the scanner that was involved in creation of an image or who was in charge of the ownership of an image or a file. The administrative metadata is, again, it's more the technical aspects, compression, modification, dates of a file, things of that nature. And then the last one, which we don't really talk about very often, is the records management metadata, which generally is more of value to records managers themselves. So it's going to give information about, what's the retention assigned to that digital file. Are there any particular rights statements associated to it, or any digital signatures that are applied to it as well. The other part of that module that was discussed on, I said, was the capturing of metadata itself. And again, this was broken down into different categories. The first one being manual data entry, which there are different pitfalls that someone could look at when looking at manual data entry. Some of the things that was discussed was, how would you handle manual data entry? Would you have a set of dedicated staff doing this that are very trained, focused on exactly what they're looking to target and capture? Or is something that you would, as like a general policy, where all staff that would be involved in it and they would be capturing data at a much smaller scale versus this dedicated staff that would have a set focus? The other part of that was being, what would you require as mandatory data to be captured versus potentially optional data? One of the, again, pitfalls here is that you could have a large quantity of mandatory data, but if you're looking at such a large quantity being captured, then you run the risk of staff either not entering it in or entering such a minimal amount of it that you may not get the value that you're looking for. And the same could be considered for optional, where you have such a small mandatory but a large optional amount of data being requested, that you're looking at staff looking at such a large quantity of potentially of fields to enter into that they may say, well, if it's optional, I'm not going to choose to enter it in because of the time commitment being needed to enter that information. So it's kind of a delicate balancing act that you're looking at in terms of that type of data entry. And the last part of that was also the controlled vocabulary. If you're having multiple staff or people entering in this information, you want to ensure that there's a set format that the information is coming in and that it's being documented in a similar way. You don't want to have someone entering in, say, a date fielded information in one format and then someone else doing it a different way, because then you're going to have potential issues in terms of searchability later down the line. The other option that we had here was called data extraction, and again, this is could be as simple as pulling data from the the file's property setting, to OCRing information from scanned images, to simple barcode recognition. This is just pulling the data that you're looking for from a particular location. And then the last category that the module focused on was called automation, and this was just more focusing towards if you're utilizing a records management system, having something in place where it would look to capture and extract out certain preset groups of metadata. Again, this could be at a high-end scale for a complex management system, or as simply utilizing auto-completion in conjunction with certain applications. And so the other module that I mentioned that I was focused on was what we call the digital preservation module that was part of the program. The main highlights from this module was that focusing on three key common threats to digital preservation. The first threat being storage media obsolescence. I think anyone that works in archives or museum or heritage organization that deals with digital records of some age is aware of this type of an issue. I think we've all at some point, I think now have seen a stack of the 3.5 or 5 1/4 inch floppy disks. Or even, as, like I said on here, as old as like the old punch cards. And one of the issues there is trying to find hardware that's capable of even utilizing that media. Nowadays it's hard to find a PC that has a 3.5 inch disk drive, let alone a 5 1/4. And then also finding staff that are even aware of what that hardware is and how to use it. You'd be surprised when teaching an intern and then showing them that there's a reason why the save icon on a Microsoft Word looks like a floppy disk, or that it's because a floppy disk was a real thing, and that's why it was based off of that. So it's trying to explain to someone who was born years after the fact of a certain type of storage device was created is and trying to train them to understand how to utilize that hardware. The other category is media degradation. This we're seeing more often with CDs and DVDs, where agencies often would store images or just electronic files on these disks and would consider it a viable storage device. And to a degree, they can be for a period of time, but depending on your storage conditions for those types of media, you could look at degradation of the disks themselves and therefore leading to loss of data. One of the good ways that you can look at is confirming that you have a good storage environment, but also considering looking at having redundant copies and having them stored at multiple locations, so that way, if forbid that one of your main storage locations is compromised and you lose data because off of those disks, you have a backup somewhere else to allow you to do data recovery. And then the other category was format obsolescence, and this is again common for certain types of proprietary software that, say, at some point in time that software was no longer being, newer versions being created, or that a company that created that software went out of business and it's no longer being supported in any way. And so then you're stuck with data that's stored on a particular, is basically requiring access to a particular set of older operating systems that aren't accessible anymore. And so this issue tends to cause more problems nowadays as well. And so with looking at these potential issues, the program itself focused on 3 different options as potential solutions to these problems. Again, these are broken down into 3 categories. The first one being a very simple one that they call technology preservation, which I love the way that they phrase this. They said it's simple as can be. You just keep one of everything. You keep one of every PC you had and one of every piece of hardware or software on hand, so that way you always have access to anything you need. The downside to this is, again, how are you going to confirm that you have enough storage in your facility to maintain one of every type of hardware or piece of software needed to access every piece of data that you potentially could have on hand? I know for ourselves at the State Archives in Maryland, we do have some older versions of hardware available that we keep on hand for that purpose, but we would not be able to keep a copy of every operating system or any particular type of software suite on hand from decades in the past to ensure that we may happen to get some data that may happen to need that particular type of software suite. So that's one of the potential issues there. And again, also for that issue is that, again, the staff knowledge. You may be able to keep a piece of every hardware that exists in software, but again, if you don't have the staff that actually understands how to utilize that hardware and software, that approach isn't necessarily a viable option either. The second category was software emulation. This one, I have seen it being used to some extent. Again, it's the idea of that creating a software that will allow you to emulate or seem to act like a bridge between the data that you need to access and, say, for example, an operating system that you no longer have access to. And it seems it's great in the aspect that you don't have to keep a copy of every piece of software ever made or hardware needed. But some of the negatives to that is that usually each emulator is going to be very specific to a particular software requirement. So if you have different variety versions of software, you're not going to really necessarily find one emulator that solves all your problems. You're going to be having multiple emulators here for this instance. They're, again, also very difficult to write because more often than not, you're not going to have access to the manuals behind that particular software suite or any access to the institutional knowledge that was used to develop that particular piece of software. So it's going to be a hard time trying to replicate all the functionality of that original piece of software. So it may be a case where, yes, you can replicate most of the functions, but there could be some key functions that are lost in attempts to emulate an outdated piece of software. And then the last option that we were presented on was on data migration. This is simply a case of where basically transitioning your data off of the older media into a newer format version of it that is acceptable to current operating systems and hardware. again, the upside to this is that, again, you don't have to be creating customized software via software emulation, and you're not looking at keeping a copy of the older hardware and software to be able to access this particular set of data. The potential issues here is, again, it's the potential loss of accuracy and functionality for some of the data when you're trying to move it from its original source of operation to a alternate version of itself. You may lose some functionality of this. You can often see sometimes through software that's needed, especially through GIS software of some type. The other one is certain type, what they quoted as difficult records. These are records where it's just in every case, no matter how much you're doing this type of data migration, you're always going to find a handful of records potentially that just for some reason the migration process is not working, and you're going to have to spend more time on that particular set of records where you may be able to fix that issue and be able to push them over, but there's also a chance that you may not be able to recover those records or put them into that newer format. So that's another potential risk with that. So as a follow-up to this particular one of the things that we were looking here at the State Archives was a particular project. We have a various collection of assessment records from the Department of Assessment and Taxation in Maryland, but there was a particular set of data that we were dealing with that was covering only a 5-year span of time for all of the state, for each counties within our state. But the problem was that that data was on a set of CDs that required to utilize this particular Kodak cold storage software, but that software needed to be run utilizing a Windows XP operating system, and that system was no longer being used on our current PCs to the point that where if we put one of these disks into our current machines, our machines wouldn't even recognize that a disk existed because of the age of the material and how it was placed onto the disk. So what we had to do was hunt for options to go for to be able to access this data, because at that time we only had one PC to access it on, and it was non-networked, and so it was one request at a time being accessed. So what our solution that we've looked at is doing data migration when it comes to this material, where thankfully the software itself had an export functionality built into it. So what we're doing is exporting the material off of these disks, and then a copy of the original file is going to be maintained in our network storage along with a copy of that original operating software. But then we're also going to be creating an access copy in a formatted text file version of it. And that way that version will be allowed to be used for public access and also to for our staff to perform their research purposes. So that's where we're at with that particular project. And then last few minutes, I think minute or so I have left here, I just want to quickly go over what I took away from our conference. One of the things that I found most interesting was the interview that was presented with the Archivist of the United States. Hearing the potential difficulties that at a federal level that they're dealing with when it comes to that transition to a digital records environment, and the tasks that they're having to deal with multiple agencies, and how to bring them on board, and how to address records management at a level when it comes to a changing environment of digital records itself was insightful for myself, because that's one of the issues that we're currently dealing with in the state of Maryland is the state itself is transitioning more and more to a digital records management environment, and so it's something that we're actively having to work with those agencies internally for that as well. And then additionally, it was also just nice to talk with other archives that are dealing with that same issue and comparing notes to see what's working with one institution versus how it's being dealt with internally at ourselves, and getting inspiration on how to handle these issues. Related to this was after the conference, I took a look at the NAR's file format risk matrix that was released a few weeks after the fact, and I've been reviewing it, and one of the things we're looking at here is trying to incorporate parts of that, at least internally, as a review of our own digital record storage to see if any potential files that are at a higher risk of loss, and how we can react to that and how to actually preserve the material. And then externally, how to incorporate some of the questions that are in that matrix as part of the evaluation for outside agencies that want to transfer their digital material to the archives. So that way we can be better aware of what is being requested to transfer into our custody and how to ensure that we can preserve it as best as possible. And that is the presentation. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about that as well. And on that point, I'll give it back to Alan.
Yep, thank you, James. Next presenter we'll hear from today is Tyler Stumpf. Tyler is an archivist in the Pennsylvania State Archives Accessioning and Outreach section. He works primarily with institutional records from prisons, mental hospitals, and other state-run facilities. Tyler is also responsible for providing records management training and assistance to state, county, and local governments in Pennsylvania. Tyler graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park, with a degree in history and library science, and is also active with the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. Now I'm going to pass it over to Tyler.
All right. Thanks, Alan. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If you can't, just send me a message and I will make sure I'll speak up. Oh, okay. Sounds like we're okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today and to talk with you all. First, I just want to thank really quickly Barb and Lisa for inviting me here to speak today and with their help behind the scenes, because it takes a lot of work to get, a nice webinar going, and so that's a lot of work that I appreciate from them. My presentation today is going to be a little bit of a departure from what you've heard from Katherine and James. When I was asked to speak to you all today, Lisa suggested that I talk about my perspective as an early career archivist going to CoSA and SAA's annual conference for the first time. This was my first time attending and my first time presenting at this conference, so that was a new and interesting experience for me. I know most of the people who are listening today, you've probably already presented at annual conferences and events like this in the past, but I thought it would be useful for you all to hear what I have to say when you're thinking about your own early career and newer staff and their professional development and their involvement. So kind of with that, let's get started. Actually, first, I should thank CoSA, of course, for all of their assistance with me being able to come to the annual conference and meeting this year. You really made it possible for me to be involved with this really, great event, and this was really helpful for me. So I just want to thank them very much for all of their support that they've given me. Okay, so I realized this morning that I should have put the title of my presentation that I did at the annual conference in my slides. I was the chair and presenter of a session called Collaborating to Preserve and Share Disability Records in Pennsylvania at the annual conference this past August. And I think the session went really well, and it was really beneficial for me, and I think for the Pennsylvania State Archives in general. We actually got a lot of benefits from that. So I wanted to kind of take you down the road of how I got to this conference, because there was a lot of work that went in the making of that and a lot of people who helped me along the way. So everything started off with, actually I just wanted to start off quickly with this thought. Shortly before I was hired at the Pennsylvania State Archives, which was about 3 years ago, I was chatting with one of my mentors at my previous job, and he had worked in state archives in the past, and he told me that if you're going to work in state archives and you still want to be involved in either writing or professional development or other things like that, those opportunities wouldn't just jump out at me like they would in an academic institution or something like that. He said the opportunities are still out there, but you're going to have to put a little bit of more work in pursuing them on your own. And so that's something I've kind of kept in my mind as I've been working here up in Harrisburg. And so that's something that kind of came into play in this, and then kind of pursuing being involved with the annual meeting. So the first steps in what became my annual meeting's presentation on disability records began actually early in 2018. I had been working a lot back then with accessioning new disability-related materials from state-run mental institutions in Pennsylvania, and we had also been working a lot with other archives in the state to help preserve materials that didn't fit within our own collections policy, but were also related to ours and very important. And that spring, our regional archives group, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference, was having their meeting nearby to us in Hershey, and my supervisor, Cindy Bendroth, who is the head of our accessioning and outreach section, she suggested that since I had been doing a lot of work with these disability records and it was really interesting, why don't you submit a session proposal to the conference organizers based on that work and see what happens. And so that ended up, they were really excited that I proposed that, and we found a good lineup of speakers pretty quickly that I had worked with from other institutions in the state. So we ended up having a panel with me and one other archivist from Temple University, a professor of disability history from one of our state universities, and 3 other members of disability advocacy groups that are active in Pennsylvania. And so that was a really good experience, and I got a lot of good feedback from that presentation. And actually, I met some people who were able to do some programming, or they were able to come in and do some research just based on that session. So that was also a really good indicator of getting this information out there, doing these sorts of presentations. There's a lot of benefits that come back to you, and you're not just sharing things with other people. So when I had this good practice run under my belt and I was feeling a little more confident, I saw what the benefits were, and they weren't just kind of long-term things, but they were also shorter-term, like tangible, really good benefits for me. A few months later, SAA and CoSA put out the call for proposals for the annual conference in Austin that we had this past year. And so again, my supervisor, Cindy, encouraged me. She said, maybe you should think about applying to this national conference, since the one that you did at our regional conference was so successful. And I thought, okay, well, that's a good idea. So I had heard at that point, because I had never presented at SA or CoSA before, I had heard that getting a session accepted for this conference could be difficult, especially for early career archivists. So I was a little nervous about getting everything together. So at first I had to think, well, do I want to find other presenters from all over the country and try and recruit them to speak with me if they would be on my session? And then I realized after a while that's going to be a lot more work, and I don't really know that many people from outside Pennsylvania. So I kind of kept the same format that I had used for our regional conference session that I did, and just kind of did a case study of what are institutions in Pennsylvania doing with disability history and collaborating together. So I ended up kind of convincing a few other colleagues in the state that I've worked with, Sierra Green from the Heinz History Center, Marjorie Sly from Temple University, and Bridget Malley, who's a graduate student at Wisconsin and a member of a Pittsburgh area disability advocacy group. And so the four of us, we had a really good diverse mix of archivists at different points in their careers and from different institutions and backgrounds. So I think that made our session proposal really strong and helped it get accepted. And that was something where my colleagues here in the state archives who had experience at national conferences, they kind of helped advise me on who were the types of other colleagues who would be good speakers, and then they helped me kind of do that. And then once I reached out to them, they were, of course, super willing and accommodating. But just thinking about who are other people that are good to present with was helpful for me to have some guidance on. I also reached out to the conference program committee for advice on writing the actual proposal. And then I also had our state archivist, David Carmichael, read my proposal ahead of time, and he gave me some comments for that. So with their help, I think that made our proposal much stronger, and so that was also helpful. Let me just skip to the next slide. A few of you who are listening may have been at my session, but I thought I'd just share a few highlights of that from that for everyone all the same. So like I said, our session was on collaborating to preserve and share disability history in Pennsylvania. And like many other states, Pennsylvania's disability history is really intertwined with the history of our state government. For most of our state's history, people with psychiatric and intellectual disabilities were institutionalized in state hospitals and state schools and other facilities like that. So the records from these institutions, which is invaluable for genealogists, historians, researchers, disability advocates, and other folks like that, these are all government records. So they can't really be deposited with any other repository besides the state archive. So we really have to be involved in this work, whether that's a focus for us or not, because we're the only place for these records and they are important. So we have to be involved to preserve and share them. But that being said, the disability history of Pennsylvania, which is just one state, it's far too big for any one institution to handle, even our state archives. So what do we do about this big challenge? In the past couple of years, I've been involved with finding collaborative partners who have abilities and resources that we don't, and then leveraging them to achieve our own goals. So by working closely with staff from other state agencies, from advocacy groups that are active in the state, and other archives, we've been able to bring in a lot of important records that we may not have been aware of otherwise. We've been able to improve our outreach and access to records very significantly, and we've been able to find homes for records that are important but don't quite fit within our own collection policy. And that would be the records of family members of institutionalized people with disabilities, the records of advocacy and activist groups, because we're primarily a repository for government records. So the records of groups that are advocating and lobbying for changes in state policy and law which impact people with disability, don't really fit within our collecting policy, so we want to make sure that they're somewhere so a researcher can get to them and our records, but at the same time, we weren't able to have them with us. So this session was recorded if you're interested, and also I'd be happy to share slides or talk with anyone from other states who's working with their own disability-related records. But that was the highlights of the session, and like I said, I think it went really well. Our other 3 speakers spoke about related topics and their perspectives from academic, museum, libraries, and from working within advocacy groups themselves. We had a really good turnout for the session. They put us in a really big room, so even though we had a decent turnout, it still looked kind of tiny, but the people who were there were really engaged, and I think a lot of people who came were interested in this specific topic because they had their own questions on their own work, which is related. So we got a lot of good questions at the end, which I was really excited about. So that was good, and that kind of went beyond the original presentation we planned. I was able to connect with other folks from other state archives, which was nice, who work with their own institutional types of records related to disability, as well as other archivists who are interested in disability records. And I've been corresponding with a lot of people after the conference ended, and we've been kind of sharing ideas, sharing strategies for collecting, preserving, and providing access to records, and a lot of other things. So that's been a really big benefit for me, even more so from the time I did this at a regional conference. I think my relationship with the other folks I presented with also benefited. Since the conference ended, we've already planned more collaborative projects that were different from what we were doing before, kind of based on conversations we had at the conference, which I'm really excited about too. And then finally, about a month ago, the editors of Archival Outlook reached out to us saying they really liked our session, and they asked if we'd be interested in writing up the highlights of our session in a short article, which of course we were thrilled to hear that, and I'm happy to say that we're going to be publishing that in their January issue, so keep an eye out for that too. That's really exciting too. So I was very glad to hear that. So overall, just a great experience, and I got a lot out of it, and I think it's really going to go a long way for me being pretty early in my career too. So I'll just wrap up again by saying that I don't think I would have gotten to Austin without all the support, both within my kind of immediate section in the State Archives and from the State Archives leadership in general here in Pennsylvania, and then also just from other neighboring institutions and people who kind of helped either support me or provided advice or encouragement along the way. And I really encourage everyone here who's listening just to consider this when you're thinking about how you could support your own early career staff in their own professional development. It really makes a difference. And I would really just hope that you would all kind of champion your early and junior staff in these sorts of things, because it really does make a difference. Thanks again to everyone for taking the time to listen to me, and please get in touch if you have any questions about anything that I've said today. So Alan, if you want to take it back, thanks.
Tyler. All right, so next we're going to hear from Kathy Popovich and Elena Perez-Lozano. Kathy Popovich is an archival program administrator at the Illinois State Archives. She supervises the operations section, which is responsible for accessioning state government records and providing reference services to the public. She's also in charge of the Archives Online Descriptive Inventory and serves as the Illinois State Historical Records Advisory Board's Deputy Coordinator. Kathy has a bachelor's degree in history from Millikan University and a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Illinois. And we're also going to hear from Elena Perez-Lozano. Elena is the Archives Bureau Chief at the State Archives in New Mexico and Santa Fe. Previously, Elena was a technical services librarian at Western New Mexico University. She is a certified archivist and holds a MLIS and a Master's in Science and Anthropology. Elena most recently served on SAA's TS-DAX Technical Subcommittee on Describing Archives, a content standard, and feels it's very important to give back to the profession, but also to keep abreast of evolving best practices and standards. And I'm going to pass it over to Kathy and Elena now. Are you there, Kathy?
Sorry, I was muted. I muted myself. Thanks, Alan. Thank you for introducing us. Again, I'm Kathy Popovich. I supervise our Operations and Publications Unit at the State Archives in Springfield, Illinois. Elena, are you there? Okay, well, Elena's also going to be presenting with me. So she is, as Alan said, Archives Bureau Chief at the State Archives of New Mexico. So Elena and I had the opportunity to attend the Archives Leadership Institute in early June of this year. So this is just a little bit of background on what the Institute is. ALI is an intensive week-long training program for emerging leaders in the field of archives. ALI is funded by the NHPRC and received the 2015 SAA Distinguished Service Award. The Institute has been held at different universities since its first year in 2008. And this year, the Institute was held at Purdue University and will be held there for the next couple of iterations. So here we're just, I started in a new leadership role last year with really no formal leadership training, and I had heard about ALI and spoke with some people that had attended previously, and they really had found a lot of benefit in doing it. So they encouraged me to apply, and so I did. Elena, do you want to talk about your interests? Are you still there, Elena? Okay, it looks like we're having some connection issues maybe. So I will just speak for Elena. Elena had heard about the program, kind of similar situation. She was a new leader, thought it would be a good opportunity to learn and do some networking. The application process was competitive. We were asked to respond to a number of different questions and really reflect on ourselves as leaders and what our vision is for the archives profession in the 21st century. There were about 80 applicants and 20 of us were accepted. So we represented really all different kinds of institutions. Obviously there were 2 of us from State Archives. We were pretty geographically diverse as well. We were most all from the States, but we did have one Canadian archivist on with us as well. The week of training really focused on these 5 themes that you see here. Excuse me, and each day we attended sessions related to a particular theme. The sessions were a mixture of lectures, discussion, case studies, and one-on-one and small group activities. So those themes were leadership, strategic planning and communication, intercultural competency and diversity, technology, innovation, and advocacy. And so now Elena and I are going to briefly go through those themes. And I am going to skip ahead in the hopes that Elena can get back on, and I'm going to go talk about my couple of sections, and we'll come back to hers. So one of the themes that we talked about this week was technology innovation. This was really a focus of the week. I would assume probably more so than other iterations of ALI. So throughout the week, different teams worked together to create a script and film a virtual reality training video related to the themes that we covered at the Institute. We were introduced to the fundamentals of virtual reality and looked at some of the equipment and possibilities for both virtual reality and augmented reality for those technologies in terms of training. And we looked at those at Purdue's Envision Center, which you can see on our slide right there. We also looked at a couple of case studies related to the use of technology in archives.
Can you hear me?
Yay, you're back. We can.
Good. I'm good. My apologies, but go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, yeah, I'll just go through mine and we'll bounce back to yours.
Sure.
So we looked at a couple of case studies, and then I think for me, the most beneficial part of this section was the discussion about the different ethical implications of new technologies and access to those technologies, and how we may have to navigate that changing technological landscape moving forward. And finally, we talked about advocacy for archivists. We examined the need for advocacy and when and how to apply it. We discussed identifying your internal and external stakeholders and other best practices in relation to advocacy. We looked at case studies and discussed different ways to approach different situations, different audiences, and to be looking for opportunities for advocacy. We also, which I found very helpful, we created some actual concrete action plans for either personal or departmental advocacy. So we took a little bit of time reflecting on something that we wanted to accomplish or a specific goal, reflecting on why that goal is important, and then actually planned out a strategy for advocating to meet that particular goal. All right, I'm going to scroll back here. Thank you for sticking with us, and I'll throw it over to you, Elena.
Okay, so I'll start with the leadership section. So the Institute, as Kathy mentioned, was divided into 4 themes, which were, leadership, strategic planning, intercultural competency, technical innovation, and advocacy. So for the leadership aspect, we had 2 of the co-directors lead us in with leadership exercises. We focused on leadership styles and traits and the difference between leadership and management, and also several in-group presentations and workshops to focus on leadership styles, and the conversation amounted to, focused on the idea that archivists usually find themselves as both leaders and managers, and we need to be cognizant of how this aligns with our organizational mission, and to think critically about emerging trends and how our organization can benefit. We had a number of small group discussions and reflections that really helped us synthesize our leadership styles and what we hope to gain from our early career leadership positions. So the output of that was we were assigned a mentor, and we also had to develop a 3-year leadership action plan, which is one output as Kathy mentioned. So the next, did you do the next slide, Kathy? I can do that. Okay. For strategic planning and communication, this is also focused on small group workshops and communication plans, and one of them was crafting strategy in uncertain times, and that focused on the processes and models that we could use to do that. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, good. Just making sure. So our presentation, so it was crafting strategy. We worked with a SOAR-based development action plan, and that was tied into our 3-year leadership action plan. So that focused on identifying our strengths opportunities, aspirations, and results. And that was used to give to our mentor in order to focus our leadership plans and what we hope to achieve in the future. And also a number of case studies, one of which was influencing without authority. And at that point, we had a lot of good group discussion about that. And then the next slide was intercultural competency and diversity. With this institute was a little different because I believe we had a lot of pre-survey work that wasn't necessarily done in the other institutes, but they're very helpful for gauging our leadership aspirations and styles, as well as our beliefs, events, and values about how we see the world. And also, there's also self-efficacy and leadership survey as well. So for the planning part, we also worked more on the SOAR-based development action plan to identify our strengths, and also working with stakeholders and developing a network of peers that can help you as you progress through your career.
Okay, I'm going to click through here.
I'm sorry, I forgot to do the slides.
No, that's
My
okay.
apologies. Okay.
That's okay. So I know we're kind of cutting it close, but and I think we both mentioned this earlier, that really there were 3 kind of concrete learning outputs from ALI. We created virtual reality simulations. There's a link to those on the website or on this slide right here. They're much better in VR environment, but you can kind of get a sense of the content that was produced just by watching these YouTube videos. Feel free to nominate Elena and I for any Emmy Awards or whatever. I'm sure there's a YouTube award thing out there. Our wonderful acting skills. Elena mentioned our leadership action plans, which was a really good opportunity to reflect on and establish some clear goals for our future careers, and then to create an actual strategy and timeline for meeting those goals. And then finally, we all created or are in the process of developing a professional workshop using one or more of the VR simulations that we developed during the Institute. And the workshops can either be done within our own institutions or just another venue for archives, professional development, and training.
And for the last slide, this was the demographics evaluation data and evidence of growth was presented to us at the alumni dinner that took place at SA in Austin. And it briefly discusses the differences in our occupation type, like with state archives, with corporate, with business archivists, our number of years in the profession, and I believe that's our geographic and ethnic representation. And then with one of the last surveys that we did, they took quotes from those surveys, and it gives you an overview of what we learned the most and what we valued the most about the Institute. And since the Institute, we've developed a pretty active social network channel in order to communicate with each other, to ask questions, to get advice, and just knowing that we can rely on each other, ask questions, so we can keep what we learned and our cohort active and connected to us and also to the wider archival community. If you want to do the slides, Kathy.
Yep.
Okay. And that's our last slide.
Yeah, thanks for listening to us.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kathy and Elena. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. But if you have any questions or want to think about any questions, I know we're up on time. But one question that I want, and maybe we can quickly talk about this, is what did you find? Did you find that the experiences you had or the training you had met your expectations, and sort of? I know some of you mentioned some of the next steps, but for those of you who maybe didn't have that or think about that, possibly what sort of next steps from your either experience or training, and I'll open up to anybody.
This is Katherine. I thought that the training I did exceeded my expectations. It was very in-depth. They used a lot of really solid examples and had a lot of exercises, some thoughtful exercises to use. I feel like what I received was a really good foundation to build off of, and I just hope to keep improving and going back to it as a reference and a guide.
I'll answer too. This is Kathy. I would say it met my expectations in the sense that people had told me who had attended ALI previously had told me that really the networking and the connections you make there are what make the Institute so great. And I would definitely say that's been the case for me moving forward. I've had lots of questions that now that I know this group of 20 archivists, I can ask somebody outside of my institution questions and know that I have this pool of people to draw on for advice.
And I would second that. This is Elena. I would second that. Having that cohort experience was extremely helpful, and it's been a great resource so far, and I'm sure it will continue to be so in the future.
Yeah, and this is Tyler, and I was going to say attending the annual meeting and giving my presentation on disability history paid off a lot for me, just because a lot of people came back to me, and then the conversations we had afterwards, people who I never would have thought to contact in the first place were coming and we were getting in touch and just learning, oh, you have some of the same problems, but you've used some different kinds of solutions, and some of them it's specific to their own state, but other ones, like that's something that we could apply in Pennsylvania too. So now, kind of like everyone else has been talking about, building up your cohort or your network of people who have the same sorts of challenges has been really, really fruitful for me since that all happened.
Yeah, this is James, and I agree with what Tyler says. It's being at the conference, allowing just being able to discuss some of the issues that I'm working with here at the State Archives, and my other colleagues are working with in their archives. It's good to get another point of view on some of the things that we're dealing with, and just being able to, there's nothing else, bouncing ideas back and forth on how to deal with these particular issues, especially on our end with the digital records management. It was very informative. It gave me an idea of different routes to look at when in terms of developing procedure and policy. So it was a very worthwhile experience.
Great, and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Are you, Lisa?
Actually, I'm not, and we'd like to honor our time commitment. So if you guys don't mind, I think we'll just, since everyone got to answer that question, I think we can just proceed from there. What do you think, Alan?
Sounds great to me, Lisa, and thank you to all our presenters.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your insight and your experiences. So just briefly, upcoming events, we've got 2 CERI webinars coming up, the one in November and one in December. So There's the link for registration. We hope you'll consider attending those. Sari always has some great webinars. This is the end of our member webinar series, but we'll begin again in January, and the Education Committee is working on some really great topics. So check out the link, and as soon as we get the schedule posted, I hope you will see you all of 2020. Now, what you can look for here toward the end of 2019 is we'll be doing Shop Talk webinars, and several of our sponsors have the opportunity to kind of provide an insight on how their tools and projects and processes can perhaps assist you in your work. It's not a sales pitch, but just kind of how things that they've seen that you may help in the industry. So again, watch for those. We're in the process of getting those scheduled right now. Now, upcoming events. The first one that you guys need to be aware of is, of course, if you're going to make a nomination for the CoSA-Ancestry Leadership Award, that deadline is November 1st, and I'm sure that our winners this year would tell you, please, please, if you know someone that you think would benefit from this, please do make that nomination. Also, November 15th is the deadline for proposals for next year's annual meeting. I know we just barely got over the annual meeting, but we do want to encourage people to think about it. Tyler's an example of how a topic you're working on, you don't realize how timely or how widespread it may be. You think it may just be affecting you, but you might be surprised who else is out there that could benefit from what you're working on. Of course, March 23rd to 25th in 2020 will be the Best Practices Exchange in Raleigh, North Carolina. And then, of course, mark it on your calendar, August 2nd through 8th will be the annual conference in Chicago this year. Of course, none of this is possible without the support of all of our sponsors and funders. And here's just a picture of some of the various funders and sponsors. And we thank them all so much because we couldn't do what we do without their support. Naturally, you want to stay connected. We learned that, but that's an important thing. And so there's lots of ways to stay connected with CoSA. We have our website. We have a resource center, which is a great place to go look for things. Why reinvent the wheel? Go check out the resource center. We have a Twitter handle, a Facebook page, and of course, we have a YouTube channel. So you can always watch any of these webinars. They are posted so that you can see them again if you missed them, or if you'd like to watch them again, or if you have a colleague you'd like to share them with. So again, we'd like to thank everyone for their time today. Thank you, Alan, as our moderator. Thank you to all of our speakers and presenters. And we hope you will take a minute and do the webinar evaluation. It really does help our education committee. And with that, thank you all today for attending our webinar, and we'll see you next time. You guys have a great day, and happy Halloween.
Thank you.